We want to welcome to the showcase our next doctoral student, and that is the Reverend Brian Harrington. Brian is the senior pastor at Starling Avenue Baptist Church in Martinsville, Virginia. His research is around reclaiming our witness, leading white Protestant congregations to racial justice. This too is extremely important research and is cognate to the conversation that we just had with Amy, and arguably around Dylan Roof as well, and socialization into a kind of toxic whiteness. So Reverend Harrington, we are very glad to welcome you to this presentation. The floor is yours. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. As Dr. Kauser said, I am Brian Harrington, and I am one of the co-pastors at Starling Avenue Baptist Church in Martinsville, Virginia, along with my wife, Ashley. And Martinsville is a small city known for NASCAR races and furniture manufacturing in South Central Virginia. Well, as we said back home in southeastern North Carolina, if the Lord's willing and the creek don't rise, I will be graduating from the Doctor of Ministry program here at Louisville Seminary later this year. I'm so delighted and humbled to have the opportunity to share my research, still in progress, with you today, and I look forward to sharing a time of conversation, including your questions to me and suggestions for me at the end of my presentation. So here we go. Next slide. In the 1980s in eastern North Carolina, a 40-year-old white progressive Baptist pastor was talking to a search committee, a pastor search committee, prayerfully considering moving to a church that the committee described as the most progressive Baptist church in the whole eastern third of the state. As a young Baptist progressive in a white world where progressive Baptist was an oxymoron, he jumped at the opportunity to serve as pastor of this church. Scarcely a month after arriving, his new church was in the final stages of calling a new music director, a young man recommended by a nearby university's music department as the best church musician around. The search committee unanimously voted to call him, and the deacons unanimously agreed. The young man visited with the choir and other church members, and everything seemed to be going perfectly ahead of the full congregation's vote in a few weeks. Then at 10 o'clock that night, the night of the introduction to the choir, the pastor's phone rang. On the other end of the line, a voice rang out, "How dare you invite that N-word into my church?" Yes, this white Baptist church in eastern North Carolina planned to call a young black man to lead their music program. And after a short conversation, the pastor and the deacons decided to move forward over the objections of this one church member, not wishing to allow a bully to dictate what happened in their church. But the bigoted bully did not back down. He mailed letters to inactive church members, to church members who were away at college, to anyone he could think of, calling them all to show up at church to vote against calling this young man, to keep this N-word out of their church. On the day of the vote, the church sanctuary was packed to nearly double its capacity. The bully's plan had worked, but did he have the votes? Sadly, I am sure that you can anticipate the answer. Those gathered together voted against calling the young black man as music minister. And when the vote was announced, the congregation erupted in whooping and hollering and applause, reminiscent of a political rally or football game. In the midst of the uproar, the the pastor's 11-year-old daughter ran into his arms and softly said to him words that were amplified throughout the sanctuary by his lapel microphone. "Daddy, why did they do this to Mr. Charles? Why? Mr. Charles is such a kind man." The room fell silent. The pastor remarked to me all these years later, "If ever the word of God was proclaimed in that church, this was it." After this episode and the abuse locals heaped on his family, with people in the grocery store yelling at his wife that her husband was an inward lover, and even his children facing abuse from their school bus driver of all people, the pastor quickly left town and left the pastorate for good for 10 years. Next slide, please. So friends, the white church in America is broken. While we experience much brokenness, the white church is especially broken in our egregious actions of replacing the gospel of Jesus Christ, which proclaims that God loves all people, with a white supremacist gospel that pretends white people are more worthy of dignity and love and full humanity than those who are not deemed to be white. Admittedly, this is a controversial assertion. Most, though not all, of us white Christians are willing to concede to the racism in our past, to our biblical defense of slavery and baptizing, lynching, segregation, and Jim Crow. But we are much less willing to admit the racism that still plagues us. Indeed, most white churches do not overtly support the supremacy of whiteness or explicitly say that black people are inferior to us. But just as the value of whiteness, as Casey and others note, is as much hidden as it is visible, so the church's participation in upholding the supremacy of whiteness is often subtle enough to remain hidden from view too. This is no accident. Next slide, please. Lee Atwater, former advisor to Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, was recorded in 1981 describing the so-called Southern strategy of the Republican Party. Listen to what he said. "You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff." To my knowledge, there is no Lee Atwater recording, so to speak, of leaders in the white church. But the increasing hiddenness of racism in the white church parallels that of conservative national politics. Whereas 40 years ago, someone explicitly said, "Why did you invite that N-word to my church?" Today, in hushed conversation, someone might ask, "Do we really want those people in our church?" Next slide, please. As Robert P. Jones demonstrated in his book, White Too Long, the white church in America, including white evangelical Christians, white mainline Protestants, and white Catholics, we're all guilty of propagating the message of the supremacy of whiteness. Jones shows through extensive research that devastatingly, white churchgoers are so much more likely than whites as a whole to be invested in the supremacy of whiteness, that a white supremacist recruiter would likely be more successful at finding new members in a church parking lot at noon on Sunday than at a coffee shop or grocery store on the same day and time. Next slide, please. Many of us white Christians are just now waking up to the reality of our brokenness. Perhaps through the hypocrisy of too many of us not only voting for, but pledging total allegiance to a man whose life, both personally and professionally, is antithetical to the example of Jesus Christ. Or perhaps some of us only identified the unholy and profane union of the supremacy of whiteness and the white American church as recently as last month, when white supremacists stormed the Capitol building and prayed in the Senate chamber, thanking God for aiding them in their attempted insurrection and attributing divine inspiration to their treasonous deeds. Next slide, please. But many people, especially our sisters and brothers of color, have known the heresy of the white supremacist church for a long time. Nearly 2 centuries ago, Frederick Douglass wrote about the religious conversion of his enslaver, saying, "In August 1832, my master attended a Methodist camp meeting held in the Bayside, Talbot County, and there experienced religion. I indulged a faint hope that his conversion would lead him to emancipate his slaves, and that if he did not do this, it would at any rate make him more kind and humane. I was disappointed in both these respects. It neither made him to be humane to his slaves, nor to emancipate them. If it had any effect on his character, it made him more cruel and hateful in all his ways. For I believe him to have been a much worse man after his conversion than before. Prior to his conversion, he relied upon his own depravity to shield and sustain him in his savage barbarity. But after his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slave-holding cruelty." Hear that again. After his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slave-holding cruelty. Instead of encountering a loving God who loves all of creation and calls us to do the same, especially loving our human sisters and brothers, at the camp meeting, the enslaver experienced a God who endorsed his hatred and cruelty, making it only stronger. In his writings, Douglass implicated not just the enslaving white Christians of the South, but also the white Christians of the North, who, though many were fighting for abolition, had no intention of proclaiming the full human dignity and sacred worth of black people, but wished to emancipate them so that they could be sent back where they came from. Almost zero white churches were pursuing racial justice. Next slide, please. Other black Americans knew the depravity of whiteness too. Perhaps most notably, James Baldwin saw white America and the white church in a way it could not and still cannot see itself. In the early 1960s, Baldwin wrote of white Americans, "They are in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years and for innumerable reasons that black people are inferior to white people, but they are still our sisters and brothers, our lost younger sisters and brothers." Sadly, most of us white Americans and white Christians are still lost 60 years later. Tim Wise, a white writer, describes the lengths to which white people go to deny racism and our participation in it, and with Baldwin, reminds us that even as tremendously harmful as the supremacy of whiteness has been to our sisters and brothers of color, it may be just as destructive to us white people. To paraphrase Jesus, what does it profit white people to gain the whole world and forfeit our souls? This cannot be who we are. Next slide, please. This reality results in a difficulty that most white Protestant pastors in the United States have in preaching about and leading their predominantly white Protestant congregations in racial justice. Because of the entrenchment of the supremacy of whiteness in most white churches and the historical and racially inspired equating of racial justice with political progressivism and, quote, politics, it is nearly impossible for white pastors to preach about racial justice without angering congregates who are invested in conservative politics and benefit from the status quo. Prophetic preaching also perturbs those who are willfully ignorant of the enduring reality of racism. To them, the labels racist or white supremacist are strictly limited to members of the Klan or the like, those blatant, overt racists. So a nice person like them could never be racist. As Austin Channing Brown notes, white people desperately want to believe that only the lonely, isolated, whites-only club members are racist. This is why the word racist offends, quote, nice white people so deeply. It challenges their self-identification as good people. Sadly, most white people are more worried about being called racist than about whether or not their actions are in fact racist or harmful. It's worse to be called racist than to in fact do something that is racist. Facing these challenges and resistance, pastors who feel compelled to preach and lead in racial justice risk losing job, livelihood, friends, social networks, and social standing. Therefore, most pastors on the race question are taking the path of least resistance. There are, however, some white pastors who are successfully leading their predominantly white congregations in a sustained pattern of racial justice, which is the antidote to the disease of white supremacy in our churches and our society. The work that Dr. Anita Coleman defines as justice for the entire human race, for all people groups, irrespective of skin color. Therefore, my research is about trying to understand what makes these pastors successful in their efforts of working toward a future where the gospel of Jesus Christ, not the supremacy of whiteness, defines faithfulness in our churches. Next slide, please. Specifically, I am asking, what are the ways pastors of predominantly white Protestant Christian churches in the United States are successfully leading their predominantly white Protestant congregations in the work of racial justice? I have identified 5 white pastors of predominantly white Protestant congregations, 3 actively serving pastors, and 2 retired pastors who have striven and continue to strive to lead their church in the work of racial justice. These pastors serve churches connected to the Alliance of Baptists, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and the United Methodist Church. I'm interviewing these pastors to understand what makes them effective in this vital work. Asking questions such as, what inspires these ministers to boldly proclaim racial justice? What are they doing to encourage their congregation to work for racial justice? What conditions led and lead to an embrace of the work of racial justice? and what resistance did and do these ministers face. Additionally, I'm interviewing 2 to 3 lay leaders in the congregations these pastors serve and asking all of the people involved in each church to complete a brief questionnaire. My research is an ethnographic case study informed by, among other frameworks, critical race theory. Next slide, please. I have hypothesized that there are effective methods used by pastors to lead their predominantly white Protestant congregations in the work of racial justice. I wondered if some of the churches are facing their imminent demise or continued decline, such that some pastors and lay people are ready to start over and are willing to follow a pastor who is being faithful to the gospel. I expected to find that these pastors have lay leadership who supports them, and that the pastors and lay leaders are willing to take the losses and the gains that result from their faithfulness. Finally, I thought that these pastors must believe that justice is the heart of the gospel, and that the gospel is primarily about how we respond to people who are discriminated against and hated. Next slide, please. My early research has shown that pastors who work for racial justice have to be committed to anti-racism, a commitment formed by powerful moments in their lives that cemented their dedication to proclaiming the full humanity and belovedness of all people. One pastor remembers as a young child looking at a picture book of U.S. history, noting how few white specks there were in pictures from the 1963 March on Washington, and wondering if he would have been there if born a few decades earlier. This earlier realization for him of the lack of white allies in the struggle for civil rights inspired him to be counted among those who fought for what is right, who enacted their faith in seeking to overcome oppression, just like Jesus. The pastor who was run out of town for refusing to block the hiring of a black music minister was formed by a father who taught him and demonstrated to him that their black neighbors were worthy of dignity, respect, and equitable treatment, and by the realization that the pastor of his tall steeple church never once preached about racism or anything else related to justice, which inspired him to not be silently complicit in oppression when he became a pastor. Next slide, please. As my research continues, I look forward to learning more about how vitally important support of key lay leaders is for a church to pursue racial justice. And I hope to be able to provide best practices to pastors who feel passionately called to preach the whole gospel, the good news of the belovedness of us all. Beyond my current research, I hope to discover more about rural and small town churches, how they can effectively participate in the work of racial justice. I want to know if it is possible to reclaim our witness, not just in pockets of progressivism, but also in places like where I live. I would be delighted if you could share with me churches and pastors in small towns and rural areas who have found effective ways to overcome the inevitable resistance to anti-racism and racial justice, to follow in the way of Christ's universal love. Friends, this work is imperative. It is a life or death situation. all of our lives and innumerable white souls are at stake. We must reclaim our witness. Thank you all so much for your time, and I welcome your thoughts and your questions.
Reverend Harrington, this is Deborah Mumford. Thank you so much for your research. Really appreciate it. I was very surprised when the first slide had Kinston on it. I was born and raised in Kinston, so thank you for the work that you're doing.
Yes.
One of the things I wanted to ask is that out of the 5 churches that you have talked about of different denominations, are those in or around Kinston? And if so, is there any recognition of the white pastors that white people are actually the minority population in Kinston? And I don't know if that's ever kind of come up. It's just kind of, I think, having grown up there, I didn't realize that African Americans were actually the majority population until I'd left, because it seemed like all the power was in the hands of white people. So is there any recognition that white people are in Kinston and some of those surrounding areas actually the minority population? And does that make a difference?
Well, that's great. And I'm glad you're a fellow North Carolinian. I'm from down below Fayetteville, so a little ways away from Kinston. But the Kinston connection is of course the church that I mentioned in the very beginning, and the experience from 30 or so years ago of one of my pastor friends there. And so I haven't looked into folks in that area any more than just talking to this pastor who spent half of his career in Eastern North Carolina. But part of what I have found, I guess, in trying to find people to include in my sample of churches that are doing this work well, is that the churches that of the pastors that I'm interviewing and the churches that are completing surveys, they're all in large cities or close to a large city. I think 2 of the churches are in the most populous cities in their state. I think all of them are close to universities or institutions of higher education. Please forgive me, but I resisted putting a UNC logo on the screen and an X through it. Because one of the pastors is his church is right down the street from UNC, or just a little bit out of town. So that's what I really want to learn more about, because I mean, as I said at the end, I don't know of many examples, if any, of places that aren't large cities, that aren't college towns, that aren't progressive centers, that are doing this work and doing it in any way that is effective. So part of it is selfish. I mean, I want some more hope for myself and the many other pastors like me that we can do this work and figure out ways to do it in ways that that pushes back against the resistance and overcomes the resistance that we face. But thank you for that.
Thank you so much for your work. It's very much needed.
Brian, this is Dr. Kauser. We've got this Lilly grant where we're working with African American rural congregations, there's a way after you successfully defend in October,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
And are hooded in May of 2022.
That is correct.
If the Lord is willing, that you join this research project, this Lilly research project, and began to look at what's going on with rural white churches and the cultural dynamics therein.
Right.
Again, almost completely understudied area of research.
Mm-hmm.
So it's wide open. Okay.
And I would love to do that because I mean, one of the churches that I guess is connected to my research project is Highland Baptist, right down the street from y'all, and there are many of us Baptists who lament that, of course, every church cannot be Highland Baptist Church in Louisville. We can't all be progressive in the same way that Highland is, but we have to try. We have to make this a priority, no matter where we are, whether we're in Louisville or Martinsville or wherever.
Yeah, you're saying make the whole gospel a priority.
Yes.
Of Jesus.
Yeah. That's I think. Yeah.
Just checking.
Is that his name?